I can try
Okay.
and troubleshoot that.
So let's see if this works. I'm going to spotlight myself and then switch to here, where we should see me and 3 people above my head, yeah?
You've done this before. You're a pro.
I have. Is it mirrored for you or just for me? Are you reading CoEverything?
It looks correct to us.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm Declan Keefe. I'm one of the co-founders of CoEverything. And along with me here is my small but mighty team. You could probably guess which one I am of those diagrams. The other 2, the one in the middle is Miriam G. She was the other co-founder with me. She's also my life partner. And then Haley Hardwick Whitman is the third up there. And we are a worker cooperative. And excitingly, this year, Haley's joining us as owner alongside Miriam and I. So we're just making that transition to our 3rd owner. There are other people who come in and out of CoEverything throughout the years, summer internships, but this is the core team who does most of the work that I'll talk about today. So I thought the way that I would go through the presentation today is talk about the different parts of what CoEverything is. There's the co part, and then of course there's the everything part. And I figured I'd start with the co, explain what that means to us, move on to everything, and explain what that means to us, and then go through a series of projects that we believe represent CoEverything. So one of the frameworks that we use for Co is this community engagement continuum. And a lot of you, I'm sure, engage community in your work and have different ways in which you bring them into a participatory design process. And we love and we do a lot of that work in our design as well. And so I just thought I'd sort of outline this, and particularly the far right end of the spectrum where we get to own. But generally, the way in which we can engage with community is we start off with informing. It's just one direction. We're doing something and we let them know that it's happening. Then we have consult, which means we let them know it happens, but we also want to hear what they had to say about it. And we may or may not do something with that information, but we want to hear it. Then there's involve, which is sort of the 2-way street. We're going to let them know, we're going to hear something, we'll probably let them know again, and we might make some changes based on that. But it's still us and individuals usually. And then we have collaborate, which is starting to get into some of the fun stuff here, where individual people within our community might be engaging with each other, might be coming up with ideas. You can see that our little light gray circle starts to get smaller in these ones, where we're engaging on a more equal level, more back and forth between them, between everybody. But still, we're not giving any of the power of actual decision making. It's all just ultimately coming back to the individual project or company. Until we get to empower, where the circles are the same size and the decision making power sort of starts to be distributed amongst community members. And community in this can mean all sorts of things, and I'll show some examples of different projects and what it means. But we're actually giving decision-making power to community folks. Then, and this is where some of our work starts to be challenging the norms of the community engagement continuum, which is own. So we shift from actually just engaging folks in decision-making power to actually creating new entities in which people in the community own either entirely or parts of the work that we're doing. And so I'll go through some examples of what that is. But once you have ownership, you still will inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. But now you also have this engagement that sort of transcends these other ones, because they've got maybe some risk. They may have some potential reward from an investment that they've made. They may choose to do greater outreach to bring more people in, because they see that sort of ownership can change the way in which their work or the community is developed around them. So this is just some framework that we use for when we're thinking about co. It's not that we'll always do projects around own, but we want to be thinking about, when we get into a project, where on this spectrum, when we engage with the community, are we actually going to land? And let's be honest about it, so that when we actually engage with folks, we can be clear what it is we're doing. We don't want to pretend we're empowering when actually what we're doing is informing. And we don't want to just inform if we have an opportunity to empower. So this is the way in which we think about co. Then there's everything. This is just, only going to take a few minutes. We'll talk about everything. But one of the ways in which we think about everything is, what are all the fundamental needs that we have as humans, right? And this may sound overly philosophical for me launching into a presentation about my small firm that I'm a part of here, but it's actually pretty core to the way in which we think about our work. And while we may use this spectrum here, which talks about things like subsistence and affection and understanding participation, all of these things, which in this theory you could see diagrammatically there, it's within one of the O that we've had from our previous diagram, within the Co of CoEverything. All of these things exist, and our theory is we can't have any one of these pieces unless we have all of these. For the sake of today, we won't go in depth into how our work touches on all of those, but we will talk about some of them. Yeah, we'll talk about how the Co affects these things within everything. And so our work intentionally touches on housing, food, energy, work, and community, all things that we believe are necessary to have a thriving life as a human. And so the theory when we started CoEverything was a question that brought us to it, which was, which things aren't better if we bring Co to it? It was like, are there things out there that if we look at this continuum of community engagement, somehow bringing more people into it, which things aren't better? And what we found is that there's probably some out there that aren't better, but a lot of these systems, somewhere along the spectrum, in some way of thinking about collaborative or community, cooperative engagement within housing, food, energy, work, and community, we're going to result in better outcomes. And specifically, it was coming from this framing that said, what if we don't have Co within those? What we have is housing that's owned by someone else, where the profits are being distributed to somebody else somewhere else. And we start to not have control of our own housing situation, which means we don't have control of our own ability to have shelter, which is a basic human need. If we don't have control of our food systems or how we access food, then what's happening is, again, whoever owns it somewhere else, a larger multinational company, is extracting wealth from our neighborhoods, and we don't have food security. Again, one of our basic human needs. Energy, if we don't have an energy system that we can control ourselves, same thing over and over. How is it the case that the things that we need to subsist as humans, to live the most basic needs, we don't even have control of those basic things? And so for Co, on the far end of ownership within the spectrum, we say, we want to do the work to try to bring co-ownership to these systems that we need to live the lives that we need to subsist and to have thriving lives, right? So we set out about 5 years ago, started CoEverything with this overly large, ambitious, there's two of us mission to change the way that we systematically own all the things that we need to live our lives. So what the heck does that actually look like, right? Like, now that we're through some of the theory work here, like how do we actually go about doing it? So the rest of the presentation really will just, I'll show a project that we're working on, tell you some bits about how we're working on it, how the Co fits into it, how does it fit into any of these categories of housing, food, energy, work, and community. So what does it actually look like? Well, the version that I usually say when people ask me what I do is none of the stuff that I just said. Usually I say we do architecture, development, and then everything else. And the everything else in that category essentially means consulting services. We offer facilitation, project management, graphic design, web design, fundraising, education, and community building. And community building sometimes physically means we're actually working with community to do construction projects, local community build projects. As well as community building, where we might help facilitate workshops and things. So that's the how. And now I'll go through a series of projects. At the end of it, I'll sort of connect the dots of how the projects that I'm showing you are somehow all related to one another, and then we'll stop for some questions. So this is the first project, which is 1463 .app crowdfund. So this is a building that is right in Dorchester and Fields Corner. These are two, the woman on the right, Dariella, is one of the project developers. On the left, Samala, actually used to work with CoEverything and is now on this other team that we collaborate with. Oh, there's Dariella. And this is a workforce housing development project. But our role in this project was actually we led a crowdfunding initiative, which in basic terms means there was a developer, T-Lee Development, of which both these lovely women are part of. And the developer said, we want to have community involved in this project somehow. And we said, well, we can do that. How involved, right? That's the question of the continuum. And so we actually went to the end of the spectrum of ownership. And so what we actually did is split the ownership that the developer had in half, and 50% of the ownership we said, we're going to go raise money from the community, offer community crowdfund investments, and offer the exact same return that the developer is getting to each of those individuals in small slices. And so we did a crowdfund where we did a series of educational workshops around what is real estate development, how does it work, where does the money come from, who's involved, what's the process look like. So we did a whole series of educational workshops before we even launched and announced that we were going to do this crowdfund. We knew as an internal team, but we were just doing an education series. And then when we got far enough through the development process, we said, okay, community members, do you want to invest? And we ended up raising around $150,000 from the community, and the community had small slices, shares of this affordable housing development. And now it's being built. You can see it's in the middle of construction here in Fields Corner. And part of the way that we took the ownership one step further, which is not required in crowdfunding, is that we introduced a democratic community committee that actually makes decisions about what'll happen in the building. Do the rents go up? Who are we going to have as a tenant? Who's going to be the project, the property manager? Those kinds of things, which was elected by all of the community investors, elected folks who chose to run to be participating in the actual management and governance of this building. So I feel like this is a great example of affordable housing, bringing in ownership and a lot of involved in this project. What we'll also see, just sort of weaving some connections, what that community decided to put in as a tenant on the ground floor is a community bookshop, which is another project that I'll get to in a minute that we have the great honor of doing design work with. So that same development team that we got brought in to do this crowdfunding, we said, well, can we do that again on another housing project? And so this is one where CoEverything is actually coming in as a co-developer. So we are becoming 50% partners with T-Lee Development. And even though this was an RFP process, we said, well, usually the RFP process tells you have to submit some version of a financial model. And we said, well, that doesn't allow us to have community engagement. And so we didn't listen to them, and we submit two options. One was a rent project with crowdfunding, and another was actual home ownership amongst the community. And because we actually presented two different models, it forced in the middle of the RFP process, a community process the city needed us to lead before they could choose who it was that they were going to give the land to. And so in the middle of this RFP process, we were able to have some community meetings, explain what crowdfunding is versus what home ownership could be, and bring the community into this process, and ultimately decided that this would be a home ownership development project along with the community, which we may still do a crowdfund for, but the crowdfund will look a little different because we won't be holding it for rentals like the previous project. So we are the co-developers of this project. We're also the architects of this project. And in all, you can kind of see right over my shoulder here is a little blue building, and this red and white building here, we're still fairly early in the design process, but in total, it's 23 units of, again, workforce housing development that we're working on as CoEverything with T-Lee Development in collaboration with the community who will be homeowners. So here's another example of housing, which is has very much a lot of co in it. This is one that is not in Dorchester. It's actually in Oakland, California. Another cooperative that we helped start with an amazing organization called Arizmendi Cooperatives. They run a bunch of different companies. They have a construction cooperative, a series of bakery cooperatives, a bookkeeping cooperative, and it's all within one cooperative entity. Arizmendi Cooperative Association, their objective is to essentially create more cooperatives that become part of what's called a second tier co-op. Together, CoEverything and Arizmendi Association of Cooperatives launched OBI, which is a backyard homes development company. And essentially, we designed this kit. You can kind of see this exploded axon here. You can see these panelized pieces here. And from the very beginning, what we were designing a model that could essentially be built by folks who have never had any experience in construction. So you don't need to use a tape measure. You don't need to know how to use a nail gun. Is screw guns you can be taught how to use in 5 minutes. It's a repetitive process for building the same pieces of panels over and over. For the floors, it's the same panel as the walls, it's the same panels as the roof, and we just can carry them into a backyard. That's why they're small, these 2 foot by 8 foot chunks. We can carry them to the backyard, assemble the building based off of essentially an IKEA style assembly book that we designed as CoEverything. And we build these little backyard homes. So 1, the construction company we're working with is a cooperative. 2, we designed this model so that we could bring community members in who can cooperatively build this with us, kind of like a barn raising style. 3, we, in addition to just building in the backyards of people's houses, one of the largest innovations that we came up with this is a lot of people can't afford to do backyard homes, and we wanted this to be for them. So the model that we have is actually borrowing from community land trusts that actually create land leases. And so what we do is we actually lease the backyard space from a homeowner. We pay them monthly to use their backyard. We then pay for everything. We develop the whole backyard unit, doesn't cost them anything. And once we get it rented, we start paying them monthly, the homeowner monthly, because we then take care of managing, getting a tenant in there that we rent out through housing vouchers. So we have an affordable tenant there. We're then providing the front yard homeowner with essentially a subsidy to pay for their mortgage, which in the Bay Area is very high and difficult to pay for. So allowing front yard homeowners some cash without having to put any out themselves. So then OBI itself is a cooperative. And so the people who are managing that. So this is like, all the co you can imagine throwing at this project, sort of it encapsulates it, which is was a pretty exciting model for us to build together with some of our heroes over at Arizmendi in the Bay Area. So back to Dorchester. This is the Dorchester Food Co-op project. So this is now shifting from housing into food. One of the ways in which we're helping support Co-Food is we are members, but we're also the architects. We also help lead some of their fundraising campaigns and leading this amazing event that you could see a photo of down here, which is the groundbreaking. So we're engaged in lots of different ways with the Dorchester Food Co-op. It's a grocery store in Dorchester and Bowden Street. They have 1,500 members, which is an amazing number considering they haven't actually opened their store yet. It's under construction right now. And this cooperative works a little different than some food co-ops. This food co-op has worker ownership, sort of like CoEverything. So the folks who work there actually will be able to own and have democratic say over some of the decisions. And then there's also member cooperative ownership, which is everybody who is a member of the food co-op has a say, gets to elect who's on the board, who gets to make decisions around, for example, there's a whole board that is part of the design committee who we worked with on all the decisions around doing the design process. We also ran large community design processes where we had hundreds of people participating in how do you design this tiny little store, where they got to have feedback in what might it look like, what to be included, is there a cafe, how much do we do we even want to locate in this specific location? All these things in which we had this amazingly diverse and wonderful group sort of participate in all of that. So there's some food work. Another project, my partner Miriam in the middle there, she is on the board of the Boston Farms Community Land Trust. And so the idea of a community land trust, usually you hear about them related to affordable housing, where you actually own a piece of land and then on top of it, someone might develop. And the idea of the land trust for housing is that it maintains long-term affordability for housing that gets built on there. And even if someone sells it, the deed is captured so that it stays affordable into perpetuity. Well, while we support land trusts for housing, which we are collaborating with some also on other projects I won't touch on today, this one is specifically related to food, but you can imagine the same idea. We want to own urban lots so that urban farmers can affordably keep farming within our cities before they get developed into something else. So Boston Farms Community Land Trust does that. They find properties in collaboration with the city, who has maybe lots that are too small to develop, maybe with donors who just want to see urban farms in the city. And then they develop them into farmable land. They partner with the Urban Farming Institute that trains urban farmers and then essentially allow these farm spaces to be farmed by local Black and brown folks. It's also the case that some of these farms, well, will grow food that currently, even through before the Dorchester Food Co-op stores open, is selling them through their essentially farmers markets. And then as the store opens, they'll have some local produce for those who get certified to grow. So we start to have connection within our community of food actually grown there, actually sold there, sort of in community overseeing that whole cycle in the food system. Moving on to this co-energy system, right? We need to be able to run these buildings that we're talking about too. So you can see the date on here is just this past weekend. We had an amazing event. What's exciting about this small world connection of CO2 is the very first solar array that we'll be developing with this new solar cooperative that we're a part of helping found is actually on the rooftop of the Dorchester Food Co-op's building, which I didn't mention, but the rest of that building is developed by Viet which is a community development corporation, and the whole building is affordable housing, and some of the units are extremely low income affordable housing. So affordable housing with a community-owned grocery store on the bottom, with a community-owned solar array on the top. And the way that we're structuring this solar co-op is, if some of you may be more familiar with the model of solar where you put it on your roof, but it doesn't cost you anything. Somebody owns that array and then you get to discount your energy. Well, we're doing that, except we're the company that pays for everything. So the Dorchester Food Co-op doesn't actually have to pay anything. We're just going to put it on the roof. It'll discount their energy. But all of the community members who co-own that solar array will actually get the benefits of the lower cost energy. So the Dorchester Food Co-op will still pay us, but they'll pay us lower than they would if they were just buying regular energy. So that's their benefit. And our benefit is that we're getting a return on the investments that we're putting in as community members. So that's how this array will work. In the future, we'll also do other types of arrays where what is technically called community solar. So that's the actual term of it. And community solar means we put it on the roof and it can actually discount your energy cost as a member. So those are the two things that being a member of this solar co-op gets you, in addition to just participating in the democratic control of your energy system. So this is sort of our example of energy and how it's tied into our food justice system, which is how it's tied into our housing systems. So this is shifting a little bit into work and how do we do community engagement and cooperative work. This was actually our very first project at CoEverything, what is called Leaf Global Arts. It's a project down in Asheville, North Carolina. And you can see a few of the different spaces in that building, but it involved dozens and dozens of community members who were artists in Asheville and around the world, who essentially the way that it was designed was we had little design leads who were artists who we, as the sort of project designers and facilitators, worked with them as part of the design team to sort of design each corner of this building. And so there's this stage you could see, and we had an artist who was designing that medallion alongside us, and we had a rug provider who collects rugs globally who provided the soundproofing in that room. And we had somebody who was a partner who knew how to do interactive graphics. So we had this on the bottom left, you can see this interactive exhibits so that the kids were a part of. And all of these things, we then brought in community members who participated with these subcommittees in designing all of the pieces. So this is one was like a really deeply engaged participatory design process through the arts locally, but then also globally, bringing in artists from around the world, which is what this nonprofit does. And so we were sort of using the mission of the nonprofit as a model for how we would do a design project for their interactive facilities, which is where kids make music, make art, and then above, there's no photo here, is the office space that this nonprofit actually uses, sort of right within this sort of community center space. Moving on, this is another project that we're in the middle of now. It's a combination of 5 different nonprofits who are coming together. We're serving as a project development consultant and a project facilitator, and the way that it actually is structured is 5 different nonprofits who wanted to be able to co-own a piece of land together. And so what us and a team of attorneys have designed is a model in which they actually can co-own it. So we've created effectively a cooperative that these nonprofits become part of, that is part of another nonprofit that technically owns the land. So this looks like us creating new ways of models for ownership so that the actual members of the nonprofit can develop properties themselves. And this includes a neighborhood birth center, so reproductive justice work. It includes a Center for Economic Democracy that does sort of economic justice work, a housing justice organization, City Life Vida Urbana, and then we have Move and Sustainability Commons, which supports organizations like this, all being located in one building. And so we're essentially the collaborator that just brings together these partners who are doing work that we believe in to sort of create a center that will allow them to continue to do their work.
Thank you.
And so this is the Community Movement Commons project. This rendering, by the way, is with a partner, Mass Design Group. We're actually not the lead architect on this. They are, to give them fair credit. And then this is the last one I'll talk about, and then we can break for some questions and conversation. This is a project that we just started, but I mentioned it early on, so I wanted to bring it in, which is the process through that crowdfund, which is the first project I talked about, led the community to have decision-making power, found a community member who wanted to start an independent bookstore. It's 2 amazing folks, Bing Broderick, who ran the Haley House for years, which is like exciting for me because my career literally started. My first day at my first company was at the Haley House, which was the place that he ran, and is now starting a bookstore along with Portia, who is actually Boston's poet laureate. And they're together starting this nonprofit bookstore in the community, the space that the community had control over and decided would sort of select this partner. And we're doing a design process with the community and them. So you can see sticky notes coming from community members, things coming into this design process, the same little figures you've seen all around sort of spread throughout our work. And we're even in this project thinking to do a community build process like we did actually with the Leaf community project, where we'll bring community members in, probably partnering with Youth Build to actually build some of this furniture, have the community actually do some of the build out and painting and engagement in the actual development and construction of this project. So there's a lot of different ways in which we things, and this is just a model for you all. This is, I'd say, not particularly unique to CoEverything and the work that we do. I think it's often just like the short version of this is word of mouth, but I think as small firms, this kind of word of mouth is what makes our work happen. But for us, we're actually thinking of it as an ecosystem of how does it actually do the work of bringing co-ownership to these systems that we care so much about. And word of mouth can actually help us create these local ecosystems. And so just really quickly, the Boston Farms Community Land Trust, there's partners that we know in that who connected us to the food co-op. Also, they'll be sharing food there. The food co-op actually is on top of the solar rooftop. The solar co-op will also be putting solar on top of the Harvard Standish project that we're developing. The food co-op, one of the previous board members, Bing Broderick, is now launching the Words is Worlds, which was totally disconnected from the fact that he's actually launching the bookshop, which is in the building that we crowdfunded on. And Words of Worlds is actually, one of the partners there is connected to this Movement Commons project. The Community Land Trust may actually use some of the land that this Movement Commons will have from property that they've acquired to farm and grow on it. And one of the consultants that helped start Food Co-op actually was who introduced us to Arizmendi and what launched our OB project on the West Coast. So just as an example of like, all of that really just means word of mouth, but what it can mean when you have a sort of a vision like we have when we launched our company to think beyond just for us, what does an architecture firm do? And instead, how do we change the world around us in a specific way? It opened up opportunities of types of work that we wouldn't have even thought were work, or that there was something we could possibly do when we started. And so some of our work ends up looking like architecture, some of it looks like development, but a lot of it looks like everything else. And sort of this is a representation of how we ended up there and the amazing people who bring us along to help them actually execute on their visions. So yeah, I'll stop there and we can chat about whatever is on your mind.
Well, thank you, Declan. That last slide with all the connections, it feels very like a beautiful mind, that like meme that goes around where he's connecting all the formulas and things. But it's inspiring to see how I think, in some ways you're doing everything, but you have a very clear agenda, which I think it's like there's a very clear umbrella that kind of unites all the work. And I think that slide speaks to that. I'm going to change my view so that I can see people. Okay. I wanted to just say, for those of you that joined late, you noticed maybe that we had issues today with the links from the BSA, so apologies for that. And I just wanted to note that this session was recorded. So I asked the BSA for everyone's email addresses so that I can share that link out when it's ready. So if anybody didn't RSVP and would like that, you can just put your email address in the chat and I'll write it down. So we have plenty of time for questions. I thought maybe I'd ask one just to kind of get us going. I think I'm very inspired by all the different things that you're up to. And I think it's funny because often as small firm architects, we hear you have to focus, you have to focus in on like one super neat, you have to be a specialist, to be successful and to like have some kind of narrative. And I do think that there's a really clear thread that runs through all of the work, but I think in a really practical way, I just want to know like how you learn all these things, because I'm just looking at like, sometimes I feel overwhelmed by the spectrum of things that we're supposed to know as architects. And I'm not even getting into like development models. And there's a lot of your work is looking at like novel financing modes or partnerships. And so, sorry, this is like the longest question ever at a lecture, but I just think, I'm just curious, is this something where you're tapping into kind of like co-op community type resources, or is there like a kind of suite of consultants that you return to again and again who help you kind of puzzle through, these like kind of new or seemingly new, partnership and financial models?
Yeah, it's a great question. It happens so differently for each project. It's kind of amazing. I'd say there's certainly a lot of people who are super smart that we've been inspired by, who we bring in on things, including attorneys, including consultants, including other designers. Like you saw, I don't know, maybe a third of those projects we weren't even architects actually on. We just were involved in some other totally different way. Some of it is our passion, right? Like that we left our firm before this. Some of you may know a company called Place Taylor. I was one of the co-founders of that company. We were a worker cooperative, and it was great. Like it was a fun, amazing company to be a part of, and we left with this mission. It really was to like, how do we do this, right? And so when we set out, it was fun, and it was great because Miriam's my life partner and the business partner. When we started, it was just the two of us, and we did a road trip. So it was 2.5 months. We just drove around the country. Like, who's doing this work? Like, and what does it look like? How are they engaging? And so we had the luxury of being able to spend time to really dive pretty deep and just like research and figuring it out. I love learning things just personally. Like it's my hobby. Like I'll end a work day and then like learn a new tool, or like research different cooperative ownership models, or read a legal agreement that some of my co-op lawyers drafted up or something like that. And so like some of that is like a lot of the work's coming from other people's thinking, and we're just sort of collecting it in new ways and then presenting it to clients as like, this sounds like the thing you're looking for? Is this actually it? And we're not going to finalize a legal agreement for them, but we can present the idea, present the scope, a way in which you all just heard sort of the vision and the mission. They're presenting a mission and vision to folks. And then if they engage, then bringing in the consultants that's like, okay, attorney, how can you execute on this thing? It's not a template. Like, let's not start with a template, because it isn't that. If you do that, I'm going to be disappointed, and we're going to do it again. And so it's like starting from knowing what it is you're getting to, as opposed to starting from the place that says, can you somebody else tell us how to get there? And that's what's been interesting for me, especially coming from my background in Place Taylor, where we did architecture, construction, and development. So we actually were the builders too, and realized the value of a like vertically integrated. It was still small. It was 20 of us, but it was doing construction, so it was a much larger revenue company than what an architecture firm is. And the ability to do things vertically integrated like that allowed us to do projects that other folks weren't. So we were one of the first passive houses because we were our own client. And in the same way with this work, is because we're engaged in these communities as community members, we can have conversations and say, we don't have to do it the way everybody else does it. Do we want to do it this other way? And from that place of vertical integration, now integration from community through the design and development process, through the architecture process. And what we've realized, the vertical integration we've now included in CoEverything is to get pretty much all of these projects off the ground, there's some sort of fundraising and financing. So we've like, who's going to pay for that? Right? Well, are we going to really bring in another consultant, or should we just like early phase do some of that work, do the web design, do some graphic design that we enjoy doing? Is it fundraising? It's like, okay, let's do it with a consultant once, and then can we replicate some of that? Sure. Okay, now we offer consulting work. Okay, you need a video, we could probably do that. Work with a partner and then try to replicate it. So it's just like we add it to the spectrum of scope we do. Some of it's because we enjoy doing lots of different things, but a lot of it's really towards the mission of how do we make these projects that are difficult to achieve because they've not been done as like rote models actually happen. And that's when we provide that service. Is it more likely to have this product outcome actually happen if we can provide it even as a small company? And sometimes we're really transparent. We're not going to be the best web designer. We're not going to be the best graphic designer. We're not going to be the best, video production crew, but we're going to do it cheaper and faster so that this project has a greater likelihood of actually succeeding. And being honest about that to our clients, I think has helped us sort of actually get to a place which we can pull off some of these really highly unlikely projects. So it's a little bit of all the things you asked.
I have tons more questions, but I want to open it up to other people. So I'm going to give us like a 10 to 15-second pause for people to gather their thinking. We can all just awkwardly blink at each other. And only after that will I ask my next question. I'm not good at counting, so it felt like 2 minutes. Okay, so you kind of just touched on this, so it is a perfect segue. I think one of the things I've noticed, actually, I worked at Mass Design Group, which we talked about before everyone else joined. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about them as a practice is that because they're this kind of hybrid of a traditional architecture firm and a nonprofit, and they're mission focused, they can allocate a certain amount of resources to certain projects. And so they're often able to help nonprofits fundraise on a kind of pro bono basis and then transition into like a fee for service kind of model. And so, what I was curious about in listening to your work is that I think, and I'm sure everyone on this call can relate to this, like I think whether our projects are, for large communities or for individuals, there's just something about us as designers that wants to see things get manifested. And it's almost like, oh, well, I really want that. Oh, maybe we can build it ourselves. Like, I think we've all had that thought at some point. And so I think what I was curious about was, as you kind of branch into these other modalities, like essentially, how do you get paid to do these things? And is it that you're putting your own kind of almost like pro bono energy into some aspects of your practice? Or are you treating it almost like an investor where you're kind of donating your time at the beginning and then, in some of these cases, like where they're more real estate ventures, getting paid at the end through sales, et cetera. So sort of like delaying your compensation. And I know that's like a really, it's either like an annoying question because you're so idealistic, or it's it's like I don't know, but I just think I've often seen architecture and interior design as like inextricably linked. And so it's felt really artificial to charge my clients for both of those services as one provider, because they feel, but then, when clients are asking for like marketing material or whatever, it does feel like, like they start to obviously get a discount through grouping these services under one person. But it may, it may take such an immense amount of time investment on our part. So like, it boils down to like, kind of how do you run a profitable business doing, or a break even kind of business, doing all the different things you're doing? And are there like interesting models that you found there?
Yeah, I don't think it's annoying at all. I think it's like all of this is part of the work. None of these models work unless you've got a model that allows you to even work on this stuff. So we work in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's hourly work and we're the consultant. Oftentimes it's that's how it works for the everything else category. When we're doing architecture, sometimes it looks like a traditional architecture fee, and it's calculated the hours we think it will take, and maybe we do a percentage of project cost or something. But we also do a bunch of other things, like the Harvard and Standish project. We're a co-developer, so like you were saying, effectively we're doing sweat equity, and so we're working for free up front, but we're actually getting essentially 50% of the stake of the project. And there's developers fees built into that. So, we're in a fortunate enough position where we don't need that dollar immediately. And what we're going to end up getting, even though we're doing workforce housing and community engagement, we're actually going to make more money on that than a normal architecture firm is. And so this is the like economic model that we're really thinking about. And why we started CoEverything is we realized that real estate development is the economic engine that makes all of these things go. right? And there's so much more money, even in affordable housing projects, there's so much more money that goes into development side of things than the architecture side of things, that if we can tap into a small piece of that, we can pay for so much more work that we care about than you can just being on one other side of it. In Place Taylor, we paid for passive house, zero net energy, high performance buildings by controlling different pieces of it. In CoEverything, we're still trying to do high performance, low energy buildings, but we're also saying, how can we also pay for crowdfunding? How can we also pay for community engagement process? And we're okay taking somewhat of a lesser developer's fee, for instance, in that project. And yes, we're sacrificing something there, but it's not a sacrifice when you compare it to if we just had architecture scope. We're actually making more money still by being part of the development team. It does require us to know more things. We have to also know how to do development work. Like, we're co-developers, not just because we're doing architecture, we're co-developers because I also am doing all the financial analysis for the project and making sure that it's possible, and the due diligence of, you know, bringing in funding and, you know, all of the pieces that comes with knowing that scope. But for all of you all who do architecture, like, that stuff's actually in my mind easier than the work that we have to do on architecture. So it's like, we can change the way we think about where the edges of our work is. It allows us to maybe bring in more capital, which in my mind is not like so I can just make more money. I want to do that so I can do something with that capital and test new projects, test new processes. We've done various different things like that, like our OB project. We'll get paid long-term over time. So we did the design work, and we're now an owner of this building that we'll own for 30 years cooperatively within our co-op. And I actually think those are kind of interesting things. I now don't have to do any more work, and every month I make some money off of it, right? Like, what kind of work do we have as architects where we just make money now that we're done doing something? Not very much. If you do that enough times, you actually will have a recurring revenue source without doing any scope for services. It totally changes how we think about what our work could be possible. Imagine 10 years down the line and I've got a rental portfolio that is paying us monthly. I now don't have to do any consulting services. I could offer this work for free, you know? And it's not that I'm not taking home a paycheck, it's that I'm being paid from other work that we've invested in earlier on to sort of start thinking about how we bring in money in different ways. And I'm really interested in it because it's not just how we bring in money in different ways, it's how our community brings in money in different ways. And that's what's exciting to me, is design a model that works for us so that it actually can benefit all the community collectively.
Can I ask a related question? This is Chris Melford. Do you end up creating separate businesses for these different activities? Or does your insurance company just tell you they're not going to insure you anymore as an architect?
When we're doing development, it is different entities. Yeah. So every individual development project is a different entity, gets insured totally differently. We do our graphic design, web design, all that stuff still within the architecture scope, within that company. The OB cooperative thing, totally different cooperative. It actually has other partners who are, I showed the 3 within CoEverything, but there's actually 4 other cooperative partners who are in that company. So a lot of times we're actually launching different initiatives. The solar co-op, it's a nonprofit and a co-op. The movement space commons, like, the way that I talk about them is that they're, our projects, we're a partner within the project, and almost always there's something else being created or formed. Which means, a lot of legal work. I think Kyle, you mentioned that of like, how are you engaging? And that's one that's creative attorneys who sort of are interested in seeing these new things happen. And that was something that we discovered in this road trip that we went on. It was like, oh, there's legal teams of people who are thinking creatively about this stuff. Actually, beyond some people in the design services work, like that's where I saw a lot of the creativity happening. Those legal teams who are like, how do we change this stuff? Because like they were trying to change things I didn't even know existed, and so then I was like, oh, that exists, and they want to change it in this way because, and how do we as designers, developers, utilize the things that they were sort of identifying for us? How do we implement them as sort of practitioners in the field? And so, but yeah, I think astute, Chris, the liability is tricky in a lot of these things.
So would it be fair to say that, as architects, you have a fairly clearly defined standard of care for the services you provide, because it's a profession that's been around for a long time. Is there a much broader way of looking at entrepreneurial activities? Maybe that's just a misnomer for businesses that allow you more flexibility in, doing things that you have no experience whatsoever in, but is part of what you're trying to achieve. And, as you were saying before, presenting to your clients, we may not be the best in this, but we can roll this into what we've been doing. That is tremendous value to the client. It's just extraordinary exposure to an architect, right? Are there other legal forms that make this easier?
Yeah, I mean, we could get into the real nitty gritty of, the distinction between worker cooperatives and how they're taxed, and the limited liability corporations or C corps, and like we do some of that work of the nitty gritty of it. I end up feeling far less concerned about the liability for those services compared to the liability we have doing development projects. There's just so much more risk out there that the risk I'm really providing in terms of creating a logo for someone and not being the best at it, at best, is the risk of the cost that I'm charging them, which is, like $2,000, like whatever. Okay, I'll pay them $2,000 if they want to sue me for $2,000 for not creating them the best logo. That's going to be okay for me. I've got a $9 million project that I'm a 50% owner of over here, but if I screw that up, that's the thing I care more about. So
Right.
It's not that I disregard it, but like the scope of the work we're working on is so much riskier in some parts that it's allowed me to feel more comfortable being risky on this like really low exposure work, which is really high value, as you describe. And that's sort of where we draw that line. Where can we provide high value for low cost to make these really mission aligned projects possible? And if we can do that, and it puts a little bit more exposure on us, like I'm willing to take that gamble. Where I really want to have the professionals like really review things, but it's more traditional, is how do I own a building? Where's my risk there?
Yeah.
Especially when, and this is where it becomes really critical for me, not just when I own it, how do I make sure that low income homeowner, who wants to invest $1,000 and has only $5,000 to their name, but they want to own something in their community and they invest it, I don't want them to lose that $1,000. And so I'm in a fortunate position where I could lose $1,000 and be okay. There's some people who can't, and I want them to feel like they could participate. And so some of the stuff we're developing on our projects now is partnering, bringing in what we're calling solidarity funds. Those people who don't have the capital, essentially grant money that we give to community members, they can invest money that we're essentially gifting to them. And so they can still invest without needing to have the capital. And so it's things like that, where we're developing models of, okay, that's risky money. Let's get it from somewhere else. Let's give it to the people who we want to still be engaged, and then let them invest that money. So if they lose it, they're losing money that wasn't theirs in the first place. So there's things like models like that, which then leads to, okay, how do we fundraise for that? Where are the grant sources? All of that other kind of work that we're sort of looping into the process.
Thank you for sharing. Appreciate it.
Does anybody else have any questions that they wanted to ask? You can put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them.
I have a question about community engagement. And like you talked about the bookstore, realized the community really wanted a bookstore. How do you go about that outreach and know that you're reaching the biggest crowd you can and aren't just hearing the loudest voices? Like, is there any kind of strategies or guardrails?
Yeah. There's strategies. I don't know if I could think of a guardrail, but some of the strategies, and first I have to give like near 100% credit to Miriam, my partner, who like leads a lot of our community outreach work. I'd say more than 50% of her time is just like engaging community. Even though she's the licensed architect. Like, so for example, she's the architect and that's what she spends her time really doing. So just as example, in the past week, it looked like door knocking on streets. So we went door to door, knocked on every door, talked to as many people as we could, left the flyer, talked to every community group that, you know, is close enough to the neighborhood, set up meetings scheduled to talk about a project that we have. You know, one of the great parts of that last slide of how everything's connected, a great value of us like being part of the Dorchester Food Co-op project is there's 1,500 members of that co-op that we have essentially direct connection to. So when we're doing community engagement in Dorchester, you know, which we're doing in Dorchester, we're also doing it with like within 3 blocks of Dorchester. Almost all, like more than half of that work is like this community, right? It's being defined really geographically is a lot of the stuff we're doing. And so we can outreach to all those people. So we have some connections there. And then as we do, you know, it's the momentum that's building behind some of our work is what feels most exciting to me, is that as we do one, we now have connection to more and more people so that the next one becomes, the outreach becomes even easier and even greater and has even more impact. So that when we do our first launch meeting, for example, of this solar co-op, we don't just get 3 or 4 people, we get 50 people from the community who show up, who want to be co-owners of this co-op, which is the very first time we've like actually put an outreach there. That's an amazing sort of piece of community outreach that we can get that type of engagement, and a thing that doesn't exist yet, with a model that's confusing, with a sort of economic background that like even experts I talk to can't explain clearly. Like the fact that that can happen is because there's trust built, not just with us, but with partners that we bring along. And that's one of the other strategies I'd say is know who's making the ask. So we might do a lot of our work, we're invisible actually. So CoEverything does the work behind, then we hand it off to who the actual community leader is there and they present it, or like the crowdfund work. We led all of it, we created a lot of the like technical stuff, but we brought in a team of community advisors. There's like 10 of them who are they're leaders within their community somehow. And we essentially said, okay, we want to teach something related to this. This is a workshop that we could do. Could you reach out and invite your friends, your family, your communities, bring them to an event? And then we might facilitate such that then they're presenting about how to do real estate development. And to see someone from their community, you know, and a lot of our communities, they're low income, it's majority minority. I'm not the guy to do that, right? I'm a white guy who's not actually even living in Dorchester right now. And that stuff matters. Like, just we can be honest and forward about that, as long as we build trust that what we're doing is actually work that we believe is actually having a positive impact, and not just because we say it, but because people who we've actually engaged with believe it and feel that and want us to keep doing that work. But it's work. I think that's the thing that, especially in architecture, when we think to do community outreach process, I think we often get stuck in thinking about the design process and then don't leave ourselves enough fee or time or the schedule flexibility to actually do the work that it takes to have the kind of engagement, especially not to get to the far end of ownership. Like that's a whole, like for us, it's a whole nother ball game when you switch from the empowerment stage to ownership. And it just goes back to Chris's point about the risk and the legal stuff. Because as soon as you make that shift, we're now creating new legal entities, which means attorneys, which means meetings about ownership, which means meetings about governance and how are we making decisions and who gets elected and how do we have that first board that's making those first decisions. An entirely different style of facilitation that happens when we make that shift. But I think that's true along that whole spectrum. This is why I wanted to bring it up. We can inform people, and that takes one thing. We need to understand what it means. We can then include them to hear something back that's different. And as we go further and further down that spectrum, we need to understand as designers or community engagement facilitators or whatever, that it requires different ways of communicating, different types of outreach, and provide time or space, or at least communicate to the client that if you actually want this to be part of it, then that's work and we have to pay for that work, right? If it's, and not assume that it's just on you as the architect to make it happen, right? So that's just sort of me injecting struggles that I had when I was doing more just architecture work. I'm like, I want to do more of this, but there's not time to do it because we're trying to move so fast. And everybody wants it to be done quicker. And again, I'm like, I'm okay where it lands, wherever on that continuum. Don't pretend that it's empowerment when it's informed. That's the thing that gets me most. Don't say it's participatory design when it's informing the community of what your design already is. And I've done, like, as CoEverything, we do some of that work. It's just, there's something else we're testing and we can't do a participatory design process. Harvard and Standish was this project. Like, we engaged them somewhat, but it was an RFP process. The city wouldn't allow us to have community engagement before that. So we figured out a way to engage as much as we could, but most of the design has happened outside of community. We're testing something different in that project, not participatory design. We're testing homeownership, crowdfunding. You know, there's a developer who's working with me who's never developed housing before. He's a local guy, African-American young man. We're training him to become a developer in his neighborhood so he can then go on and own and develop things. There's different kinds of things that we can test in each one. We don't have to do it on all of them. So I don't know. I think I got pretty far off the track of what your question was, but.
No, that's really helpful to hear.
I feel like unless people have other questions, I could ask you questions all day, but I think there's like this tension in this meeting spot, which is like, we're never, like, it's scheduled technically till 1:30, but a lot of people have to peel off at 1 for meetings. So I feel like 1:15 might split that difference perfectly. Which is not, if anyone else has a question, please speak up or put it in the chat. Okay. Well, definitely thank you for joining us today. Sorry again, everyone, for the technical difficulties at the beginning. Really puts a pall over things, but I think you handled it well, Declan, and really appreciate the presentation. That was super compelling. I think it left us all with a lot of like good new things to be thinking about.
Questioning the choices we've made in life.
A little bit.
That was a motto that we had at Place Taylor, and I carry it still, is question everything. Question how the business is set up, how we do the work, how we engage with our own employees, how we engage with the community. And it's like, if you actually pause every time you go to do anything, which tool we use, you know, when do we take lunch, you know, which clothes do we wear to work? Literally, like, that was a practice we had, was when we make an assumption about how something's supposed to be done, why is it done that way? Is it possible to change it? And sometimes we would just change it because we created a 2-hour siesta in the middle of the day one day, just to like, what happens when you change these things? How does it feel different? How do we break our assumptions from the way that we do work? So I think that was a great point to leave on, Susie, and thanks all for having me.
Yeah, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. We'll see you in a few weeks.
Bye.
Bye.